A brief respite in between wild card and divisional round playoff weekends. Let's check back in on the NFL coaching searches around the NFL. Coaching hires, a few have been trickling in. Head coaches, GM interviews, and some offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator news as well to update you on today's Peacock and Williamson.
NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson bring you expert NFL analysis every day in less than 30 minutes. Get an inside look at the NFL on the field and in the front office with elite breakdowns to next-level analysis and in-depth information only for the real NFL fans. This is Peacock and Williamson, and it starts now.
Welcome to the Peacock and Williamson NFL Show. Brian Peacock alongside Matt Williamson at BD Peacock at Williamson NFL. Thanks, everybody, for making us your first listen on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Love our everydayers. Appreciate you out there. Make sure you hit that thumbs up. Let us know you're stopping by. If you have not yet, subscribe on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcast. And, of course, welcome to all the new listeners as well to Peacock and Williamson. We got you covered daily throughout the postseason, off-season, NFL draft, coaching hires, free agency, and into season 2025 as well, as we do here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Big return right now on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets if you win or lose on that first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. A couple of hires. Let's start with the hires that have happened. We already know that Mike Vrabel has been hired. That's the first big GM head coach hiring of this cycle. Clearly, the New England Patriots had a plan. They got rid of their guy on the flight home. I can't remember if they were home or not, but like Gerard Mayo just had no shot, got fired. They wanted Vrabel. They went out. They got Vrabel. New England Patriots, they're done there. And we'd already talked about the Vrabel hire and what we think there. And he's already had a press conference and talked about his free agent plan. And so they're getting rolling. And so one of the things that starts happening here is right now things are very slow. And we're seeing some coordinator hires from teams that already have their head coach and GMs in place. But pretty soon, the teams that are interviewing all of these names, and we're going to see some of the names on today's podcast that come up a lot, they're going to start moving quickly because they want to hire their guy and they don't want to lose their guy. And they don't want to let their guy out of town when they know they have the hire that they want.
Yeah, and I'm going to start with something, and I don't know how to do. I don't think there's a good answer for it, but the process and the timeline in the NFL is so goofy for coaching hires. You know, like if you're a pretty firm team, you know, like I think the Steelers are going to move on from their defensive coordinator. The Niners did the same, but they're not going to make coaching hires. Well, they can pluck a good coordinator right now because that guy might be waiting on. Well, what if my buddy gets the Jags head guy? You know what I mean? Like there's kind of an advantage to being a stable team going coordinator hunting right now.
Yes.
Meanwhile,
and also being the sweet spot of being stable, but not also still playing in the playoffs. So
right, exactly.
That's like 49ers the last 2 years. They were in the NFC Championship game and the Super Bowl and ended up going one and done on both their defensive coordinator hires because they couldn't start hiring until February for those guys.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's so goofy because the Lions aren't. If the Lions want a new running back coach, they're not going to go hire one now. You know what I mean? Like, and all these other teams. And then, of course, some of the best coaches and most coveted are still in this thing, and they are doing interviews, but they really should be preparing for the Eagles or Lions or Bills. You know what I mean? Like, the whole process is so goofy and backwards, and you wonder why is there 8 coaching changes every year? Well, I think that might be part of it because the process stinks.
It does help for someone like Ben Johnson, who's going to interview everywhere. Everyone wants to interview him, but he had a bye week at least to have some extra time. So for those coaches that are playing every single week in the playoffs, and then you're losing one of your coordinators to a few hours of interviews during the week, that's not good because these guys don't sleep as it is. Yeah. And you don't want to be coaching in the playoffs and one of your most important coaches has half of his mind on another job that he's thinking about.
And even from the other side, the interviewer is like, that wasn't a great interview. The guy slept 3 hours last night and he's been preparing for the Lions for 23 hours straight. Maybe he's not on top of his interview game. You know what I mean? Like at least via Zoom or whatever.
Yeah, at least it's a Zoom meeting. You don't have to fly around for these interviews. So they can hop on for an hour, maybe he's even eating lunch while he's doing their interview. It's probably
Right.
pretty informal. And these are football guys. It's probably pretty informal. You'd probably be shocked about how some of these coaches in the NFL, like this is, it's still an old boys club. There's a lot of dudes around dudes for their entire life. It'd be interesting to see, probably very casual in some of these Zoom interviews. You're not at the podium. In fact, I remember when Chip Kelly got hired by the San Francisco 49ers, and he was like, I didn't even have a suit for this press conference. I had a pair of sweats. I flew in a pair of sweats. That's all I had was like team issued gear. And so it was probably very informal, guys eating, guys in sweatpants, and in some of these Zoom interviews too.
Maybe, but I mean, like in any walk of life, you want to put your best foot forward as an interviewee. And, you're sitting there with the guy that created Home Depot or Walmart, like, man, I kind of want to impress this person. And I got an hour between meetings,
Yeah. And one of these owners is used to,
right.
in the business world, like the most formal meetings where they're dressed to the nines and you've got this big presentation.
I'm interviewing a CEO,
And some of the interviews and some of the coaches probably have to realize that they're more of a fact-finding interview. And you don't want to give too many clues either. It's like, okay, what's your plan here? Well, it's like, well, I'll give you the basics, but you're going to want to hire me if you want the real plan, because I'm not just going to tell you how this thing.
Give you the answers to
if I can help the other guy that actually gets hired. So there's a lot of that.
I know. I mean, how much do you hold back? And how about interview 2? If you're really serious, if it's me and one other guy or whatever, I'll give you the whole manifesto. But some of these dudes just want to be 1 of 32. I mean, I don't know. The whole process is dumb to me. I don't know how to make it better.
It does feel like it should be, okay, Super Bowl is over. Now you can interview.
But everyone would cheat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they already do. But then
they already do. Right.
Rules against it. And we've seen draft picks get taken away for tampering and other things in free agency. So maybe a legal coach tampering period. I don't know.
It's all bizarre to me, though. Yeah. You wonder why they don't go well a lot.
So of the hires, we've got Mike Vrabel, new head coach of the New England Patriots. The only other official hire we have right now is the Cleveland Browns have added, after firing Ken Dorsey, have added Tommy Rees, who was their former tight ends coach, has now been promoted to offensive coordinator in Cleveland. They've also added offensive line coach Mike Bloomgren officially as well. So just a minor shakeup on the Cleveland Browns offense. It's funny because the 49ers tried to hire an offensive coordinator in-house as well, and they got in trouble by the league. So Kyle Shanahan tried to promote Clay Kubiak. And by the way, rough go for Clay's older brother, Clint Kubiak, who was with the 49ers as well last year. He got the Saints OC job, and now he's already out of a job again and looking around and trying to get another offensive coaching job. And so his name's on a lot of lists for some interviews around the league as an offensive coordinator. But Kyle Shanahan tried to promote, mostly in name, Clay Kubiak to offensive coordinator so he doesn't get another coach poached, basically, because Kyle Shanahan is going to call the plays. He's the offensive coordinator, but he wanted to give the name and title to Clay Kubiak to keep him away from some of these interviews so teams could not request to interview him as an offensive coordinator. And the league said, no, you can't do that. You got to interview more guys. So now the 49ers have to go through some fake interviews. And it's funny. It's like, oh, I wonder who's going to get the offensive coordinator job with the 49ers. With all these fake interviews. And then
again, like, what are we doing? We're all adults here. I mean, again, if FedEx wants to promote from within, they can. And hey, I'm all for the Rooney Rule, but it also has its loopholes too. I mean, some of that's just procedural. I mean, I know some African-American coaches interviewed, I'm putting that in quotes, for the Patriot job, but they knew they weren't getting it. Everyone on the planet knew Vrabel was getting the job. They just had to check that box. And I know coordinators isn't exactly under the Rooney Rule, but still, you would think you'd be able just to promote from within, like any other business.
Next, let's go through the list of open jobs, what we think about these jobs, and what we think about the growing lists of interviews and interest from teams for the next batch of head coaches in the NFL in the 2025 coaching cycle. Next. This episode of Peacock and Williamson brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, and especially for those fans that maybe their team is not in the playoffs, and so you want to have a little more skin in the game, a little more interest in some of these playoff games. Well, put a little cash on the line and maybe win big with FanDuel during these playoff games. And by the way, my favorite way to bet on NFL football is probably NFL draft props. And so I know a lot of fan bases out there are knee deep in draft prep already. So win some money as your team drafts the next star player to get your team back into the playoffs. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose, on your first $5 bet at FanDuel. And the FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, NFL, NBA, NHL, every sport imaginable, and of course, those tasty draft props. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sports book partner of the NFL. Let's go alphabetical here and start with the Chicago Bears, who have a vacant head coach job. And I think the Bears have interviewed by far and maybe twice as many, or at least put in twice as many requests as every other team in the NFL. So Ryan Poles trying to be thorough there in Chicago, including they had some interest, and I think we're trying to interview Bill Belichick before he took the North Carolina job. So to start with, interim head coach Thomas Brown has completed an interview. Matt Campbell, Iowa State head coach. Pete Carroll, former Seahawks head coach, has completed an interview. Interesting name there. So they've gone.
Two old guys, even though they didn't get to interview Belichick. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Ron Rivera, they've completed an interview there. Another older coach that's been around. So maybe some stability is what they're looking for here. Some younger coaches as well are on the list. Brian Flores.
He was on the 85 Bears. He was on the Ditka team.
Yes, vintage Bears.
Yeah.
Bring him home. Here's another interesting one. David Shaw, former Stanford head coach. He's a current executive right now with the Denver Broncos since he left Stanford, and they have completed that interview as well. They've done interviews already with Ben Johnson, offensive coordinator of the Lions, Aaron Glenn, defensive coordinator of the Lions. They have completed an interview with Cardinals offensive coordinator Drew Petzing, which is an interesting name. I think he might be a hot coach. I don't know if it's this.
He seems like a year away, but boy, he's done good stuff. Yeah.
Another one in that vein is Anthony Weaver, who's the defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins right now. And then Mike Vrabel was interviewed by the Titans or by the Bears before he got that job with the New England Patriots. And then that's not it. Those are just the completed ones. They've got a lot of other interview requests out in scheduled interviews as well. Brian Flores, defense coordinator from the Vikings. Marcus Freeman, head coach of Notre Dame. Mike Kafka, Giants offensive coordinator. Actually, that one's already been completed. Cliff Kingsbury, Commanders offensive coordinator. Mike McCarthy, Cowboys head coach, has an interview scheduled. Todd Monken, Ravens offensive coordinator, has an interview scheduled. Arthur Smith, Steelers offensive coordinator, has an interview scheduled. Adam Stanovich, the Packers offensive coordinator, has an interview scheduled. A lot of old defensive coaches, a lot of young, hip offensive coaches being interviewed by the Chicago Bears. And I think that is the complete.
A lot of coaches, period.
I mean, it's twice as many as any other team.
I don't know how to take that. I mean, I guess that makes perfect sense. I mean, they've been searching for a coach longer than anybody, give or take. I mean, they fired their guy. They knew this, 10 weeks ago, before the season was even close to being over. How could they not have got one, at least had a conversation with Belichick in the meantime? I mean, they fired Eberflus like 2 months ago.
Well, so Eberflus, Belichick's not on this list that I'm looking at from NFL.com, which has the official requests, but you don't have to request for Bill Belichick because he didn't have a job.
You call him up, right?
Yeah, so I wonder if there was, because there was rumored interest, and so I wonder if there was sort of their version of let's have a phone conversation or a Zoom conversation, even though it wasn't an official interview. So they might have already had that conversation, and I don't know, but I know there was rumored interest that he was one of the first names on their list.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a weird process. And what's to keep the Bears ownership from taking Bill Belichick to lunch? They're allowed to do that. They could be friends, right? And
here's what's funny. So the Dallas Cowboys have interviewed one person, or actually they've interviewed nobody. They've requested to interview Robert Saleh, former Jets head coach and 49ers defense coordinator, as the next head coach. And then they kind of had a weird chat, but wasn't a formal interview with Deion Sanders. Now the Cowboys are a week behind everybody else too, though, because they didn't come to an agreement with their head coach late, and they didn't fire Mike McCarthy on Black Monday. So I guess you can interview 20 coaches in a week like the Bears did. So
yeah, right.
The Cowboys are a little bit behind. Maybe they don't care about that though.
And again, back to your original point, maybe each of them are an hour-long Zoom. Let's just knock something out real quick, super informal. Not. Pete Carroll flies to Chicago, spends the whole day with his manifesto and, lays out how he's going to do the training and the food and everything about it, parking, a lot of names there. I don't know how to even react to that as an analyst. And I'll be honest, I say this every year. One of my least favorite things about my job is commenting on assistant coaches or, hires, because I've been in the buildings and I understand that I know that I don't know. But I do think Petzing, I thought, was an interesting conversation, and Weaver. What I've heard about Weaver, Notre Dame defensive tackle, went to a really good reputation with Baltimore, did some good things this year with the Dolphins defense. Those guys remind me of like the 4th round guard that plays like a Pro Bowler, and then the next year he gets to go. It doesn't get elected, but. Yeah, it's good to get your feet wet,
For me, I see some names on the list where I remember them as players, and I even remember them playing in the league in the draft process. And so,
Weaver's one of those.
Yeah, I was like, oh god, that makes me feel low. These guys are in the coaching ranks too, but like that's where I'm that age. I should be in the coaching ranks, So that's like, oh, okay, there. I wouldn't even be a young head coach anymore. Right? Like I wouldn't even be like,
oh no.
You start looking, it's like, oh man, because coaches all used to be old and grizzled. Now it's like every coaching hire is somebody in their 30s.
Oh, I know. I mean, trust me, I've said this on the air so many times, but recruiting Darrelle Revis, Larry Fitzgerald, Joe Flacco when they were 16, 17 years old, and now they're long gone, most of them, like, oh boy.
You're rooting for Flacco to hang on as long as possible.
Andy Lee was my other one. I mean, he was a punter for Pitt. He was there when I got there. I didn't recruit him, but he hung around a long time. He was one of the few that I actually watched his high school tape, but I think Joe's the last one standing.
So there's one official name on the list and one unofficial for the Dallas Cowboys there.
Okay.
The Jacksonville Jaguars, they have interviewed the following. They have completed interviews with both Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. I think those guys are really busy during their bye week.
Oh, man. Can you imagine what their life's like right now?
Right. Robert Saleh is almost on every team's list now. And I think from what I understand, the interview has been completed with the Jaguars. He's one of the leading candidates right now for the Jacksonville Jaguars from what I've heard. Here's a name.
I know you've always been a fan going back to the Niners days, right?
Yeah, and clearly I think he got a little bit of a raw deal. He wasn't the one picking the quarterbacks necessarily, which was the big problem, and the defense actually got worse after he left, and I know that's a lot to put on an interim coach, but I do think Robert Saleh is a really good coach and, brings a lot of energy. He's a smart person, and he'll get a DC job. Probably with the 49ers is what it looks like if he doesn't get a head coach job. That's kind of what the tea leaves say right now. Here's a name that I'm surprised isn't interviewed more often because he's so darn good. And then you look back at history and you look at how the New York Giants defeated the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, and Steve Spagnuolo was the defense coordinator for that team. He's got reins with multiple teams. He's such a good defensive coach. He had one brief stint that didn't go well as head coach with the Rams off the heels of being the Giants defensive coordinator, but Steve Spagnuolo is on the list for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's probably someone I would hire just because I think I would learn something about defense, even if someone I was going to hire. And I
think the people he knows too to hire, like if he were to build a staff.
He's so good with building his staff. And I look at Andy Reid and the Chiefs, and Andy Reid gets the best. Like Andy Reid might have the best quarterback and defensive coordinator in the NFL. It's such a great situation they have in Kansas City that they could do that. And so selfishly, I kind of want Steve Spagnuolo to get taken away to make things a little bit more difficult on Andy Reid and the Chiefs.
100%. But boy, he reminds me of Jimmy Johnson with the Eagles or Dick LeBeau with the Steelers. Like, they're Hall of Fame coordinators, if there was such a thing. There should be a wing just for those guys, or, offensive as well. And both those guys I mentioned, Johnson and LeBeau, did that short stint that didn't go well as head coach, went right back to coordinating and crushed it. And why would you leave Kansas City? You get a ring every couple of years. You get playoff checks every year. Nothing's going away. Maybe Reed retires and hands it over to you, if you want it. And you just get to draw up X's and O's all day and do your defensive coordinator stuff. And I'm sure he's well compensated as coordinators go.
Here are the other names on the list to interview for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Joe Brady, Bills OC, Liam Cohen, who's another hot name, up and coming. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Liam Cohen of the Sean McVay tree, really well thought of as Buccaneers offense coordinator right now. Brian Flores on a lot of these lists with the both Lions.
I'm glad he didn't totally get blackballed and not getting interviewed.
I mean, yeah, and with the way the Vikings played this year, he was like, he kind of had to be like, yeah, well, guess what? I'm still a great football coach. So, and it's a little bit removed from some of the weird stuff that happened with the Miami Dolphins. Patrick Graham, Raiders defensive coordinator, has interviewed.
He got a lot out of a little.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Todd Monken, another on another list. Kellen Moore, Eagles OC. And I think that's the list for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Interesting one here because I wonder if someone like Ben Johnson would be like, hey, I would love to work with Trevor Lawrence. I like some pieces on defense, but I'm bringing in my own GM because they didn't.
So I think I got this right, but I mean, they announced Balky's not getting fired way back when they let go of the head coach. But I don't think they've given him like a huge ringing endorsement, like Trent's doing the search, or maybe he still could go, I think is where I'm going with it.
I mean, the GM so Trent Baalke's in that meeting, in that Zoom meeting, right? So you got,
of course, right.
GM, whoever else, I don't know. And I wonder if while the interview's happening, Ben Johnson's texting
the owner,
Khan, and he's like, "Oh, hey, yeah, if I get this job, I'm bringing my own GM," kind of thing. Even though he's talking to, like
you can't say it on the Zoom. Like, as long as you get rid of that guy that's interviewing me right now,
or maybe maybe part of the interview is Baalke selling himself to Ben Johnson, right? Be like, oh, look, this is the plan. We've got this, and this is why it's going to work. And maybe, you help that candidate feel a little bit better.
I think Johnson to Jacksonville is leader in the clubhouse, Baalke or not. I mean, just a birdie told me that this has been in the works for a while.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm not a reporter, and I think it adds up. I think Lawrence carries more weight than people realize too.
I mean, I for sure see that, but at some point you're like the coach killer because everyone's like, oh, here's this number one pick. It's like, well, that draft was a long time ago. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, or maybe Baalke is the coach killer, but two guys have already been fired under their watch. And so I would be a little bit reticent to not be like, okay, if I'm going to get fired, I'm bringing in my own plan. I like the quarterback, but sorry, Baalke, you got to go. That's the way
I would think so too, especially if you're like Johnson and you have enough clout that you can make that, I got 5 other offers. I'm not,
a ton of open jobs in the NFL. We've still got to talk Raiders, Patriots, Saints, and New York Jets. Oh, Tennessee Titans as well. They're looking for a general manager right now. So let's get into the rest of this next. This episode of Peacock and Williamson brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs, growing your small business in 2025. It comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. That's where LinkedIn comes in. They have so much available hiring data for you that you're not going to have at your fingertips without LinkedIn as a small business owner or operator. LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions for your business. We've used LinkedIn Jobs here on the network to hire folks. It's phenomenal. And of course, it's the biggest pool of potential candidates, even some candidates that might not be actively looking for a job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality candidates. So hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. The Las Vegas Raiders is an interesting one. They've got to find some consistency here as a franchise. And they have an interesting list of names. Of course, both of the Lions coordinators, Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson, are on their list. Deion Sanders is kind of rumored there, and there's talk that Deion wants to coach his son. Could that be a potential connection? You're not going to know until the draft, which makes it really hard for Deion if he would have to let a team draft him and then try to become the coach next year, because you can't wait till after the draft to hire your coach to find out if that player is going to be there for you.
Unless you get the first overall pick, you're right.
I still think that storyline is just a little weird. It's just so bizarre to be. I get doing it on the college level, and your son follows you to 2 different colleges, but
Sure,
trying to keep that going in the NFL, it just seems a little strange, and I understand why people are talking about it, but who knows? Maybe they can all pull it off, and it works swimmingly.
It's massively strange. But Elway and Eli, when they came out, said, "I'm not playing for the Colts. I'm not playing for the Chargers." You know, like it's happened.
Yes, absolutely. Could you get it all the way down to pick number? Where are the Raiders now? Pick 6, pick 5.
I don't know. Maybe
that makes it a little bit more difficult if multiple teams would have drafted you before that.
Because if you remember, the Chargers drafted Eli,
right?
You know, and then they traded him. You know, knowing that they wouldn't sign with them. I mean, the team number 2 could just draft Sanders and be like, "Okay, who wants him?"
Another team that has interviewed Robert Saleh, or scheduled to interview Robert Saleh, Steve Spagnuolo, is on the list for the Las Vegas Raiders. I mentioned that both Lions offensive and defensive coordinators. Pete Carroll as well is another scheduled interview for the head coach job for the Las Vegas Raiders. Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph, who I think did a phenomenal job this year and probably should be on more lists, scheduled to interview. And another team that is interviewing Ravens offensive coordinator Tom Monken. And that is the list right now for the Las Vegas Raiders.
Okay. 2 notes here, as we brought up Monken a couple times. I think he's going to be one of the 5. I think he's got a really good chance to be the head guy. You know, if you look at his resume, it's really strong. I think it's time for him. But on the Raiders, I wonder, like, is Brady doing the Lions game this week? If so, shouldn't he have dinner with one of the coordinators or both the coordinators? You know, to go on a scouting mission. You know, it's so weird that he can do both right now.
Very interesting. And I wonder how much say Tom Brady has.
Right. I don't know.
Is he like in meetings, like laying out the plan? Because they don't have a general manager either. Was this an opportunity for Tom Brady to be like, okay, well, now I'm going to kind of squeeze in here as the president of operations, even though that's not really my job title. He doesn't have that big of a stake of ownership. So he doesn't wear the biggest pants, but does he have a bigger say than what his percentage of ownership is for the Las Vegas Raiders? And it's something we might not find out until after these hires are made. But is he running the show kind of secretly, or is he just doing a job and kind of has some ownership interest in a team? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, when they hire Josh McDaniels and Matt Patricia and Gronk as a tight end coach, maybe we'll know. Julian Edelman's the receiver coach, right? Yeah,
bring the whole group back. A general manager interview request, by the way, for the Las Vegas Raiders. John Spytek, who is the Bucs assistant GM. John Eric Sullivan is the Packers VP of player personnel, and Sheldon White, Steelers director of pro scouting. I have nothing to add on any of those names. You might know the Steelers guy.
Not as well as I should. He hasn't been there super long. I think this is his 2nd season with Omar since Kevin Colbert retired. That's a really hard one to comment on, because those guys don't even do interviews. You know, you don't even their defense runs a lot of blitz stuff. You know, you don't even know what they do, you know, unless
it's really hard to know in the scouting circles, in the GM circles, who the next hot name is, and, you know, who's well respected. And some guys, you know, talk great, and then in practice you're like, oh, well, it still leaves a little bit to be desired when they actually get a job. So that's even harder than speaking on assistants, because at least you know what system they came out of for coaches.
Yeah, but one thing you can do, though, is not all those guys are former scouts. You know, some of them are former analytics people. Some of them are sort of business folks that manage generally. People don't understand what that word means, but they manage the whole team generally. That they hire people to watch the tape. You know what I mean? Or some of them are analytics guys. Some of them are cap guys. You know, so you can find out their background. Some of them do not go into LSU and grind the left guard tape, you know?
Yeah, and some guys went to law school and they're lawyers. And
yeah, right, exactly.
Completely different angle, right? Here's an interesting one. Before the Titans hired Mike Vrabel, Aaron Glenn declined his interview with the Patriots. I think that's the first declined I've seen on the list. So
he probably said, "I'm busy and I know I'm not getting a job."
Right? Yeah, I'm not going to let you be
right
the Rooney Rule guy for your compliance.
Find some other token, you know, because we know Vrabel's getting it.
New Orleans Saints, Aaron Glenn again. No Ben Johnson.
I know that's who Ross wants. While you were out, Ross is starting to worry that Glenn's going to get scooped up by somebody else. Yeah.
So that's another thing that happens, though, because is the best hire the most familiar name? And you see that a lot, and you get like, oh, well, this, you know, I know the name Kubiak. of course, let's hire the Kubiak guy because Bob Jefferson, I don't know who that is. So I don't have a connection there. Is it the right hire? Or is it the familiar hire? I don't know. But Aaron Glenn is on a lot of lists for good reason. As defense coordinator of the Detroit Lions, Mike Kafka, Giants OC, has completed an interview with the Saints. Mike McCarthy is scheduled to interview with the New Orleans Saints. Kellen Moore, Eagles OC. Cliff Kingsbury, Commanders offensive coordinator. David Shaw on another list here, who's currently with the Broncos in an executive role. Former head coach of the Stanford Cardinal, and Anthony Weaver, Dolphins defensive coordinator. So we're seeing a lot of really similar names on a lot of these lists. That is the New Orleans Saints. Pretty short list right now.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to comment on. I mean, I would imagine this is an eat your vegetables type of year and, dump some contracts and try to get younger and maybe find your quarterback a year from now, in New Orleans.
The only team that can compete with how many interviews they've had just because they're doing interviews for head coach and GM is the New York Jets that can compete with how many of the Bears. They still haven't interviewed as many coach candidates, but they've got a ton of GM conversations out there as well. And they're probably still trying to decide if they want to hire a coach that hires his own GM or hire a GM that hires the coach. And so that does get a little bit more difficult. Here is the coaching list of interviews and interview requests for the New York Jets. Joe Brady, Bills offense coordinator. Brian Flores, Aaron Glenn, Vance Joseph, Mike Loxley, first time his name has come up, Maryland college football head coach. Matt Nagy, another first on this cycle, Chiefs offensive coordinator, former Bears head coach. Ron Rivera, Darren Rizzi, the Saints interim head coach. He's a special teams guy, if I'm not mistaken, right? Has completed an interview. Rex Ryan did get his interview, and he has been campaigning for this job publicly on television, and he has interviewed for that job. Bobby Slowick, Texans offensive coordinator. Arthur Smith, Steelers offensive coordinator. Steve Spagnuolo, Chiefs defensive coordinator. Jeff Ulbrich, formerly of the New York Jets, and he was the interim, so he's going to interview, as they usually always do, to try to keep the job. Probably very unlikely. Mike Vrabel, before he got hired by the Pats, did interview with the Jets. And then Joe Witt, first time we've seen his name come up, Commanders defensive coordinator.
Okay.
By the Jets.
The name that stands out is Bobby Slowick. I think there's a chance he gets fired when the Texans get let go. I mean, they can't pick up a blitz. Their scheme's a mess. I mean, last year he was a hot name, but man, this was not a good year for him.
The little sophomore slump for Bobby Slowick is offensive coordinator for the Texans, although they're advancing into the divisional round. So
yeah.
It's hard to fire coaches if your team is competing that well. That is an interesting name though. And Arthur Smith, has he done such a great job with the Steelers that his image is fixed and he's going to get a head coach job because he's on multiple lists?
I know he's very well respected around the league, and people will blame his Falcons tenure on really awful quarterbacking, but it seems like you need to do more than what you did with the Steelers this year to get back in that neighborhood, Here's what's interesting, and maybe it's a timing thing, and it's easier for GMs than coaches right now, but the list of GMs for the New York Jets, they've already completed all of them. Like, there's we've requested. These are all completed interviews, and it's a big list. It starts with Louis Riddick, ESPN analyst, John Robinson, former Titans GM, Chris Spielman, Lions assistant to the president and CEO, chairperson. He's got a long title. John Eric Sullivan, again, another player, Packers VP of player personnel. And again, all these guys have interviewed. Thomas Dimitroff, we know him from his Falcons days. We've got Mike Borgonzi, Chiefs assistant GM. Never heard of him before, but obviously he comes from the Kansas City Chiefs. So yeah,
they know how to do things over there. Trey Brown, Bengals senior personnel executive. Ray Farmer, Rams senior personnel executive. Brian Gain, Bills assistant GM. Mike Greenberg, Bucks assistant GM. Ryan Grigson, former Colts GM. I would never let him near my building with what he did to Andrew Luck. Alec Alaby, Eagles assistant GM. Darren Moogie, who is the Bucks assistant GM, and Jim Nagy, formerly with the Seahawks and now the Reese's Senior Bowl exec, has interviewed for the GM job. I think that is the entire list of GM candidates for the New York Jets. All those interviews have been completed.
Extensive. I've heard Nagy on the air a lot, and I'm a fan of what he did with the Senior Bowl, and but I could see him getting back into things. I have one other Arthur Smith note, and I don't mean this negatively or anything, but I think you can never forget this about Arthur Smith. His dad founded FedEx. So I think billionaires know billionaires. You know what I mean?
Ties from both directions, the football people and the business world.
Right. So take advantage of what you can,
Last one here real quick. And again, it's a little bit harder to comment on GMs, but general manager search for the Tennessee Titans. Of the names that match with the New York Jets, you've got Thomas Dimitroff, Mike Borgonzi, John Eric Sullivan is on everybody's list that's looking for a GM, Packers VP. John Spytek was on the Raiders list, Bucks assistant GM. And then some new names, Matt Berry, Seahawks senior personnel director. You've got Ed Dodds.
Not the fantasy analyst, huh?
No, not that Matthew Berry. No, like Matt, just to differentiate. You got Ed Dodds, Colts assistant GM, Terrence Gray, Bills director of personnel, Catherine Hickman, Browns assistant GM and VP of personnel, Reggie McKenzie, Dolphins senior personnel executive. So that is the list for the Tennessee Titans.
Okay, big job. It's not an easy one to take over.
Not at all. One of the probably third choice of the Jets job. I like the Jets job, even though it would have to be the right situation. But the Jets job is interesting because you got GM and head coach. And if you feel okay with ownership and you build a little bit of a gap between ownership and football operations, if that's even possible, and you feel good that you can operate the way you need to operate, that's still a pretty good job. And they got a lot of young, good pieces on that football team.
They do. It's just who am I reporting to?
Yeah.
Do I have say in hiring the head coach?
And how's that reporting going to go? Right. Yeah. Because I look at the New York Giants and I really feel like they might have not had the opportunity to build their team the way they wanted to. And I wonder if it's the same with the other team in New York, where it's like, okay,
very well could be.
Yeah.
I get that feeling too.
That is the list of interviews and hires. We'll see how things go, who gets hired where, and of course have it all covered for you right here, Peacock and Williamson.